Hello and welcome to the Orchard Cast. I'm your host, Jeremy Appel, speaking to you from a slice of Treaty 6 territory you may know as Edmonton. It's been a while. Hope you are well. Today we're talking about Libya. You might recall how Canada participated in NATO's intervention to overthrow the regime of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. This came at the height of the Arab Spring. Protests had spread across several authoritarian Arab states, calling for reform to their political systems. It started in Tunisia, when street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire to protest government corruption. Protests then spread to Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Bahrain. What was presented as a democratic movement soon took a darker turn. The uprisings in Libya and Syria, in particular, fueled by outside support, turned into fully fledged civil wars. While outside intervention against the Assad regime in Syria was more covert, NATO intervened in Libya under the pretext of imposing a UN-backed no-fly zone to protect civilians. It didn't take long for NATO's intervention, however, to become a full-fledged regime change operation. Canada played a leading role in this, with then Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird boasting that Canada had led 10% of NATO bombing missions against Libya. It was somewhat of a radical departure from Canada's earlier approach to Gaddafi's government, which had opened its doors to increasing Western investment in the 1990s and 2000s. You might recall that Montreal-based engineering firm, SNC-Lavalin, was charged with bribing Libyan officials to get government contracts between 2001 and 2011. In 2015, friend of the show David Puglisi at the Ottawa Citizen reported that Canadian military officials had warned the government that Libya would descend into civil war if Gaddafi was overthrown. That is precisely what occurred after Islamist rebels, with NATO air support, brutally murdered Gaddafi. Since 2014, the Libyan government has been split into two governments: the Tripoli-based Government for National Unity and the Government of National Stability in Benghazi. Libya, which for all Gaddafi's faults had the highest standard of living in Africa under his rule, has since reemerged as a migrant slave trading hub. Winnipeg-based author and journalist Owen Schalk has a new book out that details the outsized role that Canada played in the country's destruction. The book is called Targeting Libya: How Canada Went from Building Public Works to Bombing an Oil-Rich Country and Creating Chaos for its Citizens. He joins me momentarily. Owen Schalk, welcome to the Orchard Cast.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
You've got a new book out about Canada's role in the destruction of Libya and sort of the evolution of Canada's relationship with Libya that has sort of, I would say, been all over the map over the past, 60 years, say. And of course, culminated in Canada's very active participation in NATO's regime change operation back in 2011, which the NDP supported, by the way. in fact, all parties in Parliament supported it, including the Greens, I believe.
Hmm.
And so we're going to talk a lot about the sort of history of modern Libya and its relations with both the United States and Canada. But to start, Owen, tell me a bit about why you decided to write a book about this particular chapter in Canadian foreign policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the 2011 NATO war on Libya, it was hugely significant for the region of North Africa, but then also for the entire African continent. The dismantling of the Libyan government, or the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, as it was called, this supercharged Islamist insurgencies in the region, such as AQIM or Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which Western intelligence services, including the Canadian intelligence services, did warn that this would be an outcome of the intervention. Um, the war had huge repercussions across West Africa as well, with the Islamist insurgencies in those countries, and ending up claiming huge areas of territory in those countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And then within Libya itself, you had hundreds of thousands of people displaced and fleeing the country. Of a population of 7 million people, you now have 1.2 million people internally displaced. The economy has effectively collapsed. Suddenly Libya, which used to be one of Africa's most prosperous countries, one of its richest countries, and a source of employment for thousands of sub-Saharan Africans, especially, and also people from other North African countries like Tunisia. Suddenly, their source of employment and income in the comparatively developed Libya vanished, and you had boatload after boatload of African migrants, coming into Europe, which had a major impact on European politics as well. So there's huge regional effects out of this war. um, Libya, as I said, it used to be one of Africa's most sovereign and developed countries, but now it's more akin to like Somalia or Sudan in the sense that the central state has been fractured and there's no unifying power or monopoly over force in the country. And you have a range of foreign powers that have involved themselves in the country to try to get what they can out of the chaos. And it was in this context, understanding just how significant this war was for Africa and for Europe, but especially for Africa, obviously. It was in this context that I was shocked to see just how little has been written about Libya in the Canadian press, particularly, and how little retrospection and introspection there's been on the NATO intervention and on the role that Canada played in it, which, as you say, was very active. There was even, I recall, a CBC article from September 2023, it would have been, after the Derna Dam collapsed in Libya and thousands of people were killed. The CBC published an article saying that the reason the dam collapsed was because of Libya's preoccupation with war. So they blamed Libyans themselves for the fact that their infrastructure is falling apart, the fact that there's no state there able to fund the repair of this dam that ended up collapsing, and there was no mention of the fact that Libya doesn't have a state because NATO destroyed it. It's like that history is totally erased and forgotten. Um, my first book, it was on Afghanistan and Canada and Afghanistan, and I was surprised writing that just how little we remember about Canada and Afghanistan. But with Libya, there's even less of that. I feel like less knowledge and remembrance of what Canada and NATO did in Libya and the horrific consequences that it had in Africa. Um, because what you had in Libya, leading up to the NATO intervention, was effectively a civil war in which Western powers intervened to support the rebels, and they completely marginalized the African Union, which tried very hard to negotiate a ceasefire. and peace negotiations between the different factions within Libya. And instead, NATO and Canada intervened in that civil war on the side of the rebels in order to remove the Libyan government, which had come to be seen by NATO as an impediment to its goals geopolitically, militarily, and economically in Africa, because all these things are intertwined. So I would say that, when you ask why did I decide to write a book about Libya and Canada and Libya, it's really that. It's just understanding how enormously significant the destruction of Libya was, but then also how little in Canada, and this might be true in other NATO countries as well, that participated in the attack, but just how little in Canada we actually think about what we did there. We don't think about it at all, certainly at the level of the media and politicians.
Right, and I want to pick up on a thread there because your first book focused on the mythologies that shape conversations around Canada's participation in the Afghanistan invasion of 2001, which persists to this day. Specifically, this notion that Canada was fighting for democracy and women's rights and all these lofty principles. In
Mm-hmm.
the foreword to this book, you note that, by contrast, nobody in the mainstream is keen to cite Libya as an example of our benevolent foreign policy. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, potentially because of what the situation there is now. Um, Canada got out of Afghanistan before the collapse of Afghanistan really happened. Um, and Biden kind of ended up holding that bag and taking the blame for that. With Libya, we went in there. We flew 10% of the sorties of NATO forces over Libya, so that meant dropping hundreds of bombs onto targets in Libya, directly engaging Libyan government soldiers and tanks, targeting ammo depots, broadcasting propaganda to Libyans on the ground. Just like a very expansive contribution to this regime change war. And what we saw in the aftermath of this intervention is essentially a failed state. So Libya now, you have this country partitioned between two parallel governments, where each one is claiming to be the sole legitimate government in Libya. There's the government of national unity in Tripoli, and then the House of Representatives in Tobruk. Again, both backed by various foreign powers, both corrupt in their own ways. And this kind of bifurcation of the country happened very quickly after 2011, after NATO and Canada got involved to destroy the Libyan state. Um, Immediately problems started to arise when these factions were not able to impose order on the country. The instability persisted, corruption persisted, and even got worse potentially. And there were elections held, but you really saw through growing voter abstention that there was widespread disaffection with what happened in Libya amongst Libyans. And there were, negotiations between the two sides of this political divide to try to sort this out in various ways. But you still have this situation now with two competing legislatures in Libya, two competing security forces, thousands of foreign troops stationed in Libya, backing either side. There were supposed to be national elections in 2018. They were rescheduled to 2021, but they still haven't happened. Um, it's just a mess of a situation. Militias run rampant, exercising control over large segments of the population. Assassination attempts in Tobruk in 2022. Libyans stormed the parliament building. In August 2024, there was this huge dispute over the central bank of Libya that saw Abdul Hamid Dbeiba, who's the president in Tripoli, storm the central bank and force the governor of the bank to flee the country, and almost reignited the civil war. So just at the everyday level, life is so difficult for people in Libya. Hundreds of thousands require humanitarian assistance. So many still displaced. Food insecurity and hunger is a huge problem because agricultural production declined so much after 2011. You know, hunger and food insecurity just wasn't as much of a problem under the Jamahiriya. Now it is. So it's an appalling situation. It's a powder keg, and there's really no way to disconnect all of this from what NATO did. I mean, there's no way to claim now that when NATO went in and Canada went in, that they removed this evil authoritarian dictator and they helped a democracy grow and flourish in Libya. There's just no way to say that that happened. And then you look at how vulnerable Libya is um, to natural disasters like the flooding of the Derna Dam. It's just it's a complete mess and failed state all over. And I really think that at the level of the media and the government in Canada, they've just been satisfied to effectively wash their hands of it and to say, you know, there's no need for accountability. We did what we could, but you know, Libyans just weren't able to make it work. David Cameron said that directly in the U.S. or in the U.K. rather. He said, you know, we went to Libya, we tried to give them democracy. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it work. So he was directly blaming the Libyans for their predicament. In the CBC, you see them doing the same thing with that article that I mentioned about the dam flood. So yeah, it's really a matter of there's no way to defend what Libya has become today, and nobody in Canada really wants to reopen that can of worms and invite that public discussion about was this a good idea.
Yeah, and I guess in the case of Afghanistan, you know, Western forces withdraw and the Taliban takes over again. So it's sort of, in a sense, it's back to where we started. With Libya, though, it seems to be a whole lot worse than that. That it's actually like a total um, dis- destruction of that society and its like structures and institutions. Um, so it makes it a lot harder to argue um, as supporters of U.S. empire would for Afghanistan that hey, look, we tried, but it just didn't work, right? Because in Libya, um, you know, and we'll get into this momentarily, but I mean, Libya had a high standard of living under Gaddafi, right? And there were,
Mhm.
popular institutions that allowed people to have their say in the government, although, Libya was an authoritarian state overall. And, a lot of power was rested with Gaddafi. But there's no question that the country is worse off now than it was prior to the intervention. Um, and so I want to maybe go over a bit of the history here with Libya, because really the story starts in the late 1960s, right? When Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi leads a coup inspired by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt against the pro Western monarchy of King Idris. And he presides
Mhm.
over all of these really radical transformations in both foreign and domestic policy. So, could you tell me a bit about some of these changes that were implemented by Gaddafi in creating this Arab People's Jamahiriya, as it was called?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the first thing I would say about that is that, you know, Gaddafi and this revolution that he led in 1969, um, it was really a product of many different Libyan realities and the regional context too. Like you said, he was very influenced and inspired by Nasser in Egypt. At the same time, they drew upon this, you know, anti-imperialist history and tradition within Libya itself, like people like Omar al-Mukhtar, who fought against the Italian colonization. Then you had a lot of oil nationalism going on in the 1950s and 1960s leading up to the coup. Very radical oil workers unions um, organizing, calling for the nationalization of oil in order to develop the country, to move away from this model of dependency that existed in Libya under King Idris. And when the revolution happened in 1969, it really embraced this history and it embraced these demands. And for many Libyans, it acted upon them in a way that they found very, very inspiring. And I should say that it's called in Libya or it was called the Al Fatah Revolution in 1969. It was more of a coup, but it was a coup that they decided to call a revolution because um, the goal of it was to completely remake Libyan society. It was to radically break with Libya's past and to go down a completely new national path. And Gaddafi emphasized this in his first coup after the speech, or in his first speech after the coup, rather, where he said that, now we break with being dominated by the UK and the US. We're no longer dominated by the UK and the US. We break with the history of being dominated by Italy before them, by the Turks before them. He was saying now we are sovereign for the first time ever. And the policies that he pursued, they really, they really answered that call. He kicked out foreign troops, shut down this massive U.S. airbase, the Wheelus Air Base in Libya, that housed thousands of American soldiers. In the early 1970s, he nationalized the oil, and he used the oil revenues from that not only to, fund wide-ranging social protections within Libya in terms of, building thousands of new homes, universal health care, education for the population that they had never had access to before, like university level education, even funded by the state. And for many Libyans, this was great. And things did change quite soon after the revolution. It's usually demarcated sort of going into the 1980s. Things started to change, and really in the 1990s, that was when the country started to stagnate. Because you had in the 80s Libya go to war in Chad, backing this group called Frolinat, which was opposed to the government in Chad because the government in Chad was being backed by France. So Libya viewed this war in Chad as a way to continue to challenge colonial influence in Africa, but they got more than they bargained for because they ended up in this war now, not only against the Chadian government, but also against France, also against the US, also against Israel. Israel got involved. And it really drained resources from the country. And they didn't gain anything from it. They had gone to war also to try to claim sovereignty over this strip of land in Chad bordering Libya called the Azov Strip, which Libya said was unfairly given to Chad by France and Italy. He didn't claim it. He ended up having to acknowledge Chadian sovereignty over the Azov Strip. Thousands of Libyans died essentially for nothing. And then in 1988, there's the Lockerbie bombing. And in the aftermath of that, Libya has multilateral sanctions imposed on it, which cost the state billions in revenue. So not only has the legitimacy of the Libyan revolution been hurt by the loss in Chad, but now they're losing so much money because of this sanctions regime. And corruption grew as a result, as you might expect. In the 90s, there was also more internal resistance to Gaddafi than there had ever been before, most of it taking on an Islamist character. They led a coup attempt. They tried to assassinate Gaddafi, and the Libyan government responded very repressively. So it was a very different internal situation than, say, the 70s. And then that led into the decision by the Libyan government to open up to the West because they were saying, we've lost so much revenue from these sanctions. The economy is hurting so much. We need to find a way to to re-legitimize ourselves in the eyes of the Libyan people. And there was a lot of debate and disagreement within the Libyan state, but ultimately they did decide to open up economically to the West, which in a way led to the downfall of the Jamahiriya. But there's this prepackaged idea of Libya that we get in the West, that we receive, and we all know it well. That Libya under Gaddafi was a totalitarian state with a terroristic foreign policy, and it was all driven by the personal whims of this unpredictable madman dictator in Muammar Gaddafi. And before I began researching this book, I didn't fully buy into that narrative necessarily. I knew better than to just blindly trust it. And at the same time, this book was not motivated necessarily by a desire to delve into the development of the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. It was motivated firstly by a desire to explore Canada's military involvement in Libya and Canada-Libya relations. But I started researching Libya as part of this project in like early 2023, and I became really interested in the history of the country and the development of the Jamahiriya and all of its accomplishments and its failures, the many challenges that it faced. And it's true that when you dig into the scholarship on the Jamahiriya, you can't escape the personality of Muammar Gaddafi. It's at the forefront of so much of the scholarship. And I do think in many ways he was kind of an erratic and unusual leader, to put it mildly. But he also did very little to stem the growth of corruption in Libya, which led to a lot of internal problems. And that's how SNC-Lavalin was able to insinuate itself with the Libyan government, just through bribery, just like textbook corrupt practices.
Right, because
Hmm.
before I sat down to read your book this past week, I had almost entirely forgotten that the corruption charges against the company, now formerly known as SNC-Lavalin, related to its dealings with Libya. That's because so much of the media coverage focused on former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's effort to pressure his then Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, to let the company off with essentially a slap on the wrist. The
Yeah.
company, which is now known as Atkins Realis, what were they up to in Libya?